Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for a very special National Science Week event. My name is Upulie Divisekera, and I'm a scientist, I'm a medical researcher, but I'm also a book obsessive, and I hope the rest of you are too. And I'll be moderating tonight's discussion about science in the library. Now, first of all, on behalf of the State Library, I would like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. Well, the State Library's collection is enormous. There's at least 5 million items, and each of them harbours its own stories. But it might be surprising to many of you to learn how many of these items and how much of the state collection is focused on or related to science. And it's certainly something that, as a scientist, I was really delighted to learn for myself. So tonight, we will be illuminating the many different aspects of science at the library, from exploring the rare and fascinating science books that live here in the collection, to dissecting how scientific methods help us to preserve treasures like these for future generations. And we'll see how women have participated in science across the generations. So tonight we are joined by 3 wonderful speakers to my left. So these wonderful speakers, their day-to-day work at the library kind of unites the humanities and sciences. So in other words, they have the best jobs. So first of all, I'd like to introduce to you, right in the middle, Senior Librarian, History of the Book and Arts, Dr. Anna Welch. Anna works with the library's rare books, and you will see a few of those at the back this evening, and the newly instated Women's Writers' Fund, which has allowed the library to acquire books written by pioneering women, writers and scientists, some of which are on display tonight. And right next to me, I have exhibition curator Linda Short, who developed and curated the library's latest exhibition, Handmade Universe, which will be open after this session. And this exhibition spotlights contributions in scientific fields by women that haven't been widely celebrated. Please welcome Linda. And finally, we have Conservator of Photography and Paper, Katie Glenn. Katie works daily to conserve and care for the library's photograph and paper-based collection items. So please welcome all of our speakers. So today's actually a very interactive event, and this discussion is just the beginning. So after our discussion, we won't actually be having questions because our speakers will be sticking around, and you will be able to go and have a look at the books, the exhibition, learn some of the work involved with conservatorship, and speak to our speakers there. So if you have questions, you can ask them directly. So please hold on to your thoughts. So we also have a curated display of rare science books, and they've never been displayed before, so this is a really good chance for you to have a really nice sticky beak at some books which are up to 300 to 400 years old, and they're at the back resting on their little pillows. So the library's conservation team have also set up a demonstration table to showcase some of the equipment that they use, the materials and the techniques that are used to maintain the state collection, and they would love to talk to you about the science in this work, because there is actually quite a lot of wet lab science going on here. And they'd also like to share with you some of the interesting items that they've been able to work on. And finally, the library's latest exhibition, Handmade Universe, will be open for an exclusive after-dark viewing. The exhibition ranges across disciplines, from craft to coding and from astronomy to botany, and highlights the importance of quiet, self-led discovery in understanding our world and beyond. So just a few housekeeping things. The bar will remain open through the night, so please feel free to get up and get a drink at any time. And before we get started with the discussion, please just, if you haven't already, please switch off your mobile phones. And also, the bathrooms are actually in this room. They're just a little bit sort of towards the centre and on the right-hand side, or maybe your left-hand side. And there are accessible bathrooms at the back of the room. So, we have so much that we can talk about today. I can't wait to start. So, I think I'll start with Linda, and Linda's curated this wonderful exhibition, Handmade Universe. Linda, this exhibition is a wonderful selection of objects with scientific and even cosmological bent. But most of them are actually made by women, using crafts that are traditionally associated with women, that are regarded as very domestic and associated with very old-fashioned sort of domesticity when, women had to learn to sew and to knit. And one of the objects in this exhibition is this spectacular work by Sarah Spencer, who hacked a knitting machine, created her own code to create this incredible piece called stargazing. So can you tell us why stargazing is such a unique object, and what does it represent?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I curated Handmade Universe with my colleague Bethan Johnson, and we were inspired to follow this line of inquiry that Upulie's just explained around craft and science when the library received stargazing as a gift to our map collection. And it's a very unusual map. It's a one-of-a-kind knitted star map. And it showed us really how scientific breakthroughs and innovation could arise outside of the academic sphere, but in personal and domestic spaces instead. So it's called Stargazing, and it's at the centre of the exhibition, as you can see in this picture. And it was made by a local artist and software engineer, Sarah Spencer. And Sarah is incredibly passionate about combining her talents for craft, for knitting, and also for computer coding in a way that can engage people in the STEM disciplines, and often in unexpected ways like this work. It wasn't really just the impressive size and the kind of curious makeup of this knitted star map that caught our attention, but it was also about how and where and why Sarah had knitted it. So I'll just show you a close-up of the work.
It's just gorgeous.
It's pretty incredible. It measures 3 by 5 meters. It's made with about 15 kilograms of locally sourced wool from the Bendigo woolen mills. And it took about 100 hours of knitting. But the way that Sarah knitted it was pretty remarkable, because for many years before, she'd been experimenting with upcycling vintage domestic knitting machines. So she'd bought one in an op shop for like $10 or something. And then that's where her kind of interest in re-engineering them began. And she started to add all kinds of gadgets and gizmos. I'm not scientific, so I can get away with that. But she also wrote a new knitting machine code that allowed her to turn her domestic knitting machine into what she calls a knitting network printer. And that's Sarah at her knitting network printer. And so she'd done something that had never previously been accomplished before with domestic knitting machines. And so she was able to make her machine stitch one knit per pixel, so she can knit any image at high resolution and at scale, and as accurately as is scientifically possible. Because most knitting machines would knit one stitch to 4 pixels, which makes any kind of pictorial image a little bit out of whack. Now, she did all of this when she was on parental leave at home with a newborn baby. So she told us that she wrote the code while she was adjusting to life as a new parent. And even though her hands were incredibly busy, her mind was seeking kind of other kinds of stimulation at the time. And so she would actually run this code as she was trying to crack it, I guess, through her mind in like late hours in the evening, early hours in the morning when she was with her new son. And I guess when she told us and explained that to us, it was kind of a light bulb moment about where we wanted to go with this exhibition, and follow that less expected line of inquiry around how art and craft can play a really important part in scientific pursuits, and especially those that happen in the home setting. So we spent lots of enjoyable months sort of exploring the library collection and other collections to find examples of handcrafts that function as tools for learning about the world, and also working with artists and creators like Sarah to present works in the exhibition that really look at how science and technology can push time-honoured crafts like knitting into completely new realms.
Yes, it's such a stunning work, and I mean, knitting, the ancient Egyptians kind of invented knitting. There's evidence of knitting in the pyramids, so it's kind of staggering to think that we're still doing it as a hobby, or as a job many centuries and millennia later. But it's also interesting to me that, she had to actually change some parts of it because it wouldn't have been high resolution enough. And to me as a scientist, that sounds exactly like the way that we get data from, say, microscopy and so on. So each stitch is a pixel, so that gives you the level of resolution there, which you wouldn't normally get otherwise. And who would have thought that knitting and microscopy would be sort of similar? Because that's where we'll pull data from the amount of information we can get from each pixel.
And I should say, when she solved the code and was able to produce knitting like this, she's kind of, I guess Sarah's always up for a challenge, and she thought, well, what can I knit that's larger than life? And so for her, that was the night sky, which is a piece of science that's live around us, and that we can all relate to, and that was really what made her decide on mapping the night sky with this technique.
Yeah, a lot of these arts and crafts, embroidery and knitting and crochet and so forth. I mean, there's also examples of crochet in this exhibition, but while they were regarded as women's work, and it was very much work, it was something that you had to, you had to finish. You had to mend the clothes, you had to make clothes, everything was done by hand, for many, many centuries. But there is an aspect to it of expression, of self-expression for women. So it's not just work, it is also a creative pursuit. So from the domestic to the cosmological and the metaphysical, I'd like to touch on the gorgeous and deeply meaningful work by Wurundjeri Wurrung artist Mandy Nicholson. Now, this work is called Dharangulk Beak. It's a huge piece. It actually envelops the entire exhibition, and it's a complex piece with so many layers of meaning and a lot of knowledge in it. So, Linda, can you tell us what it represents? And there's also another map that Mandy's created on kangaroo skin, and how is it related to this larger work as well?
Okay, so this is the design for the work on screen, and Mandy's design represents her Wurundjeri creation narrative, and also honours her relationship to Star Country, or Dharangulk Beak, as the work is titled. And so all of Mandy's artworks, she works across many different mediums, preserve and carry forward traditional ancestral knowledge, including scientific knowledge. And this design shows how in Wurundjeri culture, country is one physical and spiritual entity made up of 6 interconnected layers. And so Mandy has described the meaning of the design in an artist statement. It's available as a postcard you can take away in the gallery. And I'll use her statement to describe the work and use her words. So the gradation of colour that you can see represents the sun setting at twilight as the sky is sort of transitioning from those beautiful oranges and reds into the deep colours of the night sky. And Mandy really wanted to draw our attention to those colours, because if we stop, spend time with the night sky and look closely, we can see that it's not just midnight blue. And the large diamond at the centre honours Mandy's creator Bunjil, the wedge-tail eagle. And rather than representing Bunjil as an eagle, as he's often depicted, Mandy wanted to honour him in a different way. So Bunjil lives in the night sky in his spiritual form as the star Altair, and this is how he appears in Mandy's design. And then the smaller diamonds on either side represent Bunjil's wife, Gunawara, the black swans, and they are the stars that form Bunjil's shoulders in the night sky. And then these 3 diamonds are interwoven by these sort of sinuous lines that cut through, and they're the dreaming tracks that tell the narrative of Wurundjeri country, and the song lines which map country. And then the line work that you see throughout the design is honouring the carving techniques and patterns that are unique to southeastern Aboriginal design. So Mandy actually hand drew this before. She turned it into a digital artwork, and as Upulie said, it was then printed on material that wraps most of the Victoria Gallery, and it really kind of holds the exhibition in this Wurundjeri universe. So this is an image of Mandy when she was coming in to look at some of the test prints that we were trying out to get the design just right.
What was the fabric?
The fabric is actually a very sophisticated kind of shade cloth, and we chose that because it's a commercial grade shade cloth, and we could have one complete piece down each side of the gallery, and it actually holds the print really well, so it was important to make sure the colours were correct. So that was a bit of a collaboration between Mandy and our exhibition designer as well. And then you mentioned the other map.
There's actually another item that Mandy has produced, and it's this kangaroo skin, and that's, to me, as a medical scientist, it looks like a cell, but what it is actually a map.
Yeah, this is another star map that Mandy made. It's an earlier work made about 20 years ago, and it's actually in the collection of the Koori Heritage Trust. So we have this item on loan, and it's hand painted, incredibly intricate design on kangaroo skin. And the central part, so that deep blue part in the middle, shows the Southern Cross constellation reflected in the water of Port Phillip Bay. And so you can see the 5 stars of the Southern Cross. And in Mandy's design, they're honouring the 5 clans of the Eastern Central Kulin Nation. And so the map is actually describing how this area of country was flooded by the creation of the Birrarung, the Yarra River. And if you get a chance to have a look in the exhibition, look out for this tiny little smudge in the design, because at the opening, Mandy was with us and with her daughters, who are now young adults, and she was pointing out the smudge to one of them that they had made when they were really little and wanted to be hands-on with her work in the studio. And it was just this really lovely moment to sort of understand the process of making the map for Mandy.
Yeah, it's a really stunning piece. The smudge is actually a tiny blue smudge of paint towards the bottom, so it's lovely that you have this incredible star map, these incredible cosmological maps, basically, and there's still that little touch of the domestic, which is a refreshing view on it. The other thing that I think is astounding about it, I mean, this is the creation of Port Phillip Bay, and First Nations people witnessed it happening, and they've passed on that, like they directly witnessed it happening, which was the flooding of a range of marshes and small lakes. And that's how Port Phillip Bay formed, because it's only 10,000 years old, which is pretty amazing. Okay, so just one more quick question. Can you tell us why there are Playtex bras in this exhibition? What do they have to do with space travel?
I'll move on
of
to that.
all things.
So the bra is definitely meant to grab attention in the exhibition, but also to school us in a little known but critical role of undergarment makers in achieving the first moonwalk during the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. So seamstresses employed by the company behind Playtex, which is called ILC Dover, redirected their needlework skills to help engineer the Apollo moonsuit. And that was when the company beat established military competitors to win the NASA contract to design this moonsuit. And so what happened was the cutting edge kind of materials and technologies and production techniques that had revolutionized Playtex bras and girdles and underwear for high street shoppers were applied to producing a moonsuit that could keep astronauts safe and supported and comfortable in space. So the same language that was being used to market the underwear products to women in high street fashion. So when we started to research this story and look at the historical records around it, there really wasn't much documentation about the collaboration between ILC and NASA. And there certainly wasn't much documentation around the collaboration that had to happen between the seamstresses and the engineers. But we did find that Life magazine had some kind of exclusive on reporting the space mission. And one of the articles in one of our issues in the collection actually talked about the role that the women had in the engineering of the space suit. And one included this fantastic image. You can just see at the top, sort of center, of the seamstresses working with engineers on the assembly line. And it was incredible scientific work as well as needlework, and it demanded great precision sewing. Most of the suit had to be made by hand, so it was still a handcraft, because it had about 21 layers of materials and insulating fabrics, and apparently a misplaced stitch in the suit, even by a hair's width, would have been life-threatening to the astronauts who were walking on the lunar surface. So most of it was created by hand. And this is an image of one of the team leaders, Hazel Fellows, because the finishing touches to the suit were actually made on sewing machines. And we found out that the sewing machines, which were nicknamed Big Mo and Sweet Sue, so there were two sewing machines that were used, and the seamstresses actually hacked the machines. So they hacked them to give them greater control over the stitching, and to be able to, it was the foot pedals that they reprogrammed so that they could fire one stitch per footfall. And it just made us instantly think of Sarah's reprogramming of the knitting machine to knit one stitch per pixel. And so this was an image that we sourced from the Smithsonian archives that we wanted to have in the exhibition. And we wanted to have it near Sarah's knitting machine, which is on display. Because here were two examples of women re-engineering technology in order to do something completely unprecedented. And in this case, it was taking humankind to the moon and back. But there was also this lovely look back to one of our early conversations with Sarah, when she was explaining. She's very patient in explaining all of the science behind her creation and how she went about creating the knitting network printer. And she told us that to keep her motivated, she actually had this little button badge pinned to her knitting machine. It was a NASA badge, and it had the motto, "Failure is not an option." So she just knew she had to keep going until she'd achieved that. So it just felt like a great story to have in counterpoint to Sarah's star map.
Yeah, that's spectacular. I mean, I don't think I would have ever associated corsetry with making the spacesuits, but spacesuits are precision engineering, and a lot of particularly Western sewing techniques throughout history, and corsetry in itself is pretty much engineering. It's a form of engineering because clothes are structured in a certain way. And for spacesuits, of course, they have, what, as Linda said, 20 layers, not just to keep you warm, but to prevent you from dying from radiation, because we have the atmosphere to defend us, and astronauts only have the spacesuit. So it's a tiny little Earth that they carry around with them. So those are some really fantastic examples of the way that women have actually been sort of participating in STEM, and in a non-traditional way, but using the crafts and the skills that are, generally part of, the traditional gendered labour. And, in that vein, what we know about history, most of history is, it's written by men, it involves men. Men go out to battle, to explore and so on, and often women are left at home. The field of the intellect and the battlefield were traditionally considered, of course, in the past, and sometimes are considered, the realms of men. We've talked about the domestic arts as an outlet for women, for expression as much as part of gendered labour. But Anna, some of the works that you've selected and which are on display here at the back suggest that perhaps this idea of history as opposed to her story, if that's not always the case, that women were not always the ones who stayed at home and who didn't write the books about science or do the experiments. So can you talk a little bit about some of these amazing works that you've uncovered by women scientists?
Yeah, thanks, Upulie. And I think there are a lot of really interesting crossovers with some of the works Linda's been talking about. I'm thinking particularly about the kind of interaction between different spheres of women's lives, navigating the movement between the domestic and the intellectual. And we can see that very clearly, particularly in the life of the woman whose work you see on the screen above us, Upulie Divisekera. And I should say, just to begin with, that we've been really fortunate to have the key support of some very generous donors, one of whom's here with us tonight, Helen Sykes, who helped us to found a new initiative called the Women Writers Fund. And we came to the idea of needing a fund of this kind, I guess really, because of, as you said, Upulie, there is a tendency for history to contain largely the voices of men and their experiences. And it has been harder to represent the experiences of women for a whole variety of reasons, but considering the Western printed tradition, because women aren't always in a position to publish works in a formal way, in the same way as men. So for that and a variety of other reasons, the library's collection has had some real gaps, particularly in earlier centuries. I'd say we're much better at consciously collecting many different voices in our contemporary work, but earlier in the library's history that couldn't be said to be the case. And so there are fantastic and important works by women scientists across the centuries, but many of us have not heard of these women because their works are not represented in collections such as this one. So Upulie Divisekera is a fantastic example in that she was a contemporary of Voltaire and other leading figures of the Enlightenment. And while we all know their names, we perhaps aren't as familiar with hers. And the book that you see on the screen here is her first published work, which is Institution de Physique. And it's another really nice overlap with some of the domestic connections that you talked about, Linda, in that Divisekera actually wrote this book from the lessons that she was giving to her own son in Newtonian physics. I mean, I'm sure all our mothers gave us lessons in Newtonian physics. I know mine did. That's why I'm here with you tonight. No. Like Linda, I'm in no way a scientist, so I can only speak as an enthusiastic outsider from these disciplines. But de Châtelet, like all the women we can talk about from the book perspective tonight, was born into a wealthy situation. She was the daughter of a minor noble. She was the only girl in her family. We don't know much about her early education other than that she had a good one, and unusually for her time and her class, she was encouraged in her intellectual pursuits. And she married relatively young, had 3 children, and then by mutual agreement with her husband went back to more or less living separate lives, and she picked up her studies of mathematics and physics, which she'd sort of had to put aside while child rearing. And she went on to specialise studying in natural sciences and mathematics, and to be one of the period's leading experts on Newtonian physics. And she was known as one of the only women who could understand Newton. That should probably be one of the only people who could understand Newton, perhaps. But she published this work in 1740, and she famously, for many people, went on to have a long-term relationship with Voltaire. She lived with him for the rest of her life after they began a relationship in the late 1730s. But right towards the end of her life, she actually had an affair with a different poet and became pregnant and died in childbirth in 1749. And in that same year, she had completed her translation of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, and I've got that slide next. It was published formally in 1756, so just 7 years after her death. And it's a remarkable achievement, not only to have translated Newton's great work, The Foundations of Modern Physics, which held sway up until the theory of relativity was proved in the 20th century. She was one of few people who could not only translate this but also add commentary to it. And this translation of hers, published in 1756, is still the French translation in use today. So she really was a remarkable woman, and unusual for her time, but I think that's what we learn through endeavouring to make our collection more representative, is that there are women's stories to hear, to find there. We just have to look a bit harder for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting that you said that she was one of only, 5 people or several people, a certain number of people who could understand.
Oh, a very small number.
Yeah, the very small number,
Yeah.
whatever it is. But I mean, the same thing was actually said of Einstein's theory of relativity, which is that there are only 5 people in the world who can understand it at the time when it came out, or so it was said. So it's kind of interesting that you have the same thing happening at different periods in history. It's interesting. There were a few women scientists around that era that we haven't heard about. And given this particular publication and a few of the other ones that you've acquired for the library, what do they tell us about women's participation in STEM?
Well, I think, on one level they tell us that what we probably already perceived, that it was not easy for women to be involved in the sciences in this period in a formal way. And the next woman who I'll mention stands out because she is in stark contrast to the experience of most women, and you could probably say the same of de Châtelet. Laura Bassi was a contemporary of Emilie de Châtelet. She was born in Milan to a very wealthy family, and she was a child prodigy who could speak 11 languages by the age of 11. And she, no pressure. She was known as the Minerva of Bologna, where she eventually would study. And she was a woman who again had access to a privileged education, which was unlike that of most other women, even of her class. But of course, we're only talking here about a very privileged part of society. But she was, recognised by her peers as an extraordinary intellect, again in the field of physics and natural sciences. And she was the first woman to receive a doctorate in physics, and also only the second woman ever to receive a doctorate of philosophy. She was the first woman to be a professional academic, and that was at the University of Bologna. And I think in all these firsts that you can associate with someone like Laura Bassi tell us just how difficult it was for women. I mean, we're talking about the height of the Enlightenment, a period where literacy is quite widespread, education is relatively widespread, but it's still very unusual for a woman to be able to make her way into the professional practice of science. But, you know, I think the other side of that coin is that women did do that. Women did make their way in. That's right. And, you know, they're doing so at the same time as rearing children. Lara Bassier had between 8 and 12, nobody's quite sure. And she lived a long life and published 5 papers in her lifetime, but was, you know, reputed as the leading scientist of her day in terms of Newtonian physics. So that's an extraordinary achievement. And I think next to her I have another Bolognese scientist who was a mathematician, Maria Gaetana Agnesi, and she was an extraordinary figure too. Although she took a different path in that she didn't marry, she was very devout, and she had a bit of a battle really with her father, who wanted her to pursue her obvious gifts for mathematics and the sciences, whereas she wanted to become a nun and to lead a devout life. And so she compromised and did a bit of both. But she never taught formally at the University of Bologna, even though she was elected to a professorship there. But she was the first woman to publish a mathematics textbook. So, you know, by uncovering these somewhat rare examples, we are expanding our understanding, I think, of the wider intellectual scene of the 18th century, the Enlightenment, and revealing rather that it did contain women and women's perspectives and voices and their contributions that were recognised at the time by their colleagues as of great importance. And it's really the atrophy of history that has hidden them from us, rather than any lack of recognition for them in their own day.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I mean, the way that I was taught science is, you know, you're always taught science in a very linear sort of fashion, and particularly with physics. And so you start off with the Enlightenment, and then it kind of, you know, goes from there. And if you want to understand how we ended up with the way that we perceive and understand and study the atom now, you need to have that whole narrative. But those narratives, I would only include, say, Marie Curie, and actually her book, Radioactivity, is also on display. There's a first edition. That would be it. You'd sort of hear about everybody else, and then it'd be Marie Curie as an anomaly, and then, you know, later on, towards the end of the 20th century, you'd hear about more women scientists. But to find out that actually historically, certainly women from very privileged backgrounds, including Ada Lovelace, who was, you know, the daughter of Lord Byron, they were there, and they were there making discoveries. It's just that for some reason, you know, we haven't heard about them that much, unless you're in mathematics and physics, I suppose, and really like to go into the archives. But it's kind of encouraging, personally, as a woman in STEM, to find out that there is actually a long history of women in STEM at the sort of professional edge of it.
Absolutely.
I guess, rather than, you know, I mean, we've also seen from what Linda was saying, from the exhibition, that women have always kind of done work that's related to STEM, or, you know, expressed. It's thought in scientific terms, yeah. You know, so, you know, even being a seamstress requires you to think like an engineer. So it doesn't mean that women haven't been participating, but yeah, it's. I think it kind of changes our understanding of how women have participated in STEM. So it sounds like it's rather than it being nothing and then something, it's more a case of a little bit at a time, different points in history, conveniently erased or forgotten.
Well, and I think that's why it's so important for collections such as this one to strive really hard to include the fullest account of that history that we can, because these are the repositories from which narratives are made, and if we have all those voices there for people to discover, they'll know, as you said, that picture didn't just start with Madame Curie, it actually goes back many centuries, and that there's more to discover there. So it's the onus is on the collecting institutions to help make it possible to understand those narratives.
Exactly. So it's a real treasure trove that you've discovered here. So speaking of these sort of really old books and publications, including works from women scientists, they take a lot of maintenance and care. So how do you go about studying them and presenting them? Like, do you have to wear gloves? And,
well, that's the hot question. You'll notice that my colleagues are not wearing gloves this evening. I'm sure Katie will be able to talk to you more about the topic of gloves, but we certainly as the curators working within the collections, we work really closely with Katie and her colleagues and defer to their advice on how best to handle and display materials. And you'll see that the rare books here tonight are on lovely little pillows that have been made especially for them. So they're held at an angle that is comfortable for the book's spine so that no damage is done by holding the books open at this point, and the lights are nice and low to keep them from overlight exposure. But we don't wear gloves when handling books.
Okay.
We wear gloves if handling photographic materials or anything metallic. To handle paper and particularly books, gloves make you more clumsy and more prone to do damage to an item. So clean, dry hands are the recommended standard for handling rare books. You heard it here first, folks.
It's really hard to get away from that image of the glove.
The white gloves.
The white gloves.
I think it's what we see in documentaries, and so we have a tendency to imagine.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's in the photo opportunity, but it's not what we actually do.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the preservation of these old manuscripts and publications is also part of the library and actually involves a startling amount of science. And this is the domain of Katie Glenn, and she's the conservator of photography and paper. And obviously there's a lot of photography and paper involved with science and scientific works. But it's kind of amazing to find out that there's actually a lot of wet lab work going on at the library. So we have some photographs in this exhibition, and they were commissioned by a self-taught naturalist called Edith Coleman. And she made this amazing discovery that there are certain species of orchids that mimic the shapes of the insects, and in this specific case, wasps that pollinate them. And this particular conundrum sort of confused many, many naturalists, but she actually found final evidence that the orchid had evolved to develop the shape of the female wasp so that the male wasp would fertilize it by attempting to mate with it. She was the first person to sort of capture this actually happening and to provide evidence for this. And there are these amazing stereographs, so they're basically like little photographs where you kind of have to cross your eyes a bit to look at it so that you can see it in 3D. So the photography technique is similar to the way that we now film 3D movies. But the thing about them is that they were just kind of kept in a little tin box. I think what did he use to hold stamps or matches or sit with a cigarette? So they found these precious first photographs that proved this amazing evolutionary adaptation. So Katie, have you often had to deal with this sort of like casual, slightly cavalier approach to preserving very old photographs?
I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, I wish I could think of some interesting example that, that is really weird. I'll probably think of one tomorrow. But, we all have, an enormous accumulation of photographs, and it's, what do we do with them? How do we keep them and, keep them safe for future generations? Photographs can basically be stored in any receptacle imaginable, I suppose. But I suppose, the most obvious thing that we encounter is photo albums. And, these are really wonderful in terms of preserving photographs. I don't know if you've heard of albumum photographs, which is, was the dominant 19th century process. And it's a real treat when you find some in a photo album because they will be their original sort of rich, deep purple colour, which, the ones that we encounter now tend to be yellowy, because that's how albumum ages.
So albumum is actually
it's egg white. Yeah, so that's the binder that holds the image-forming material, which is the silver just on paper. So it's a 2-layer photographic process, and very common in the 19th century. We deal with them a lot. But then on the other side, we have albums that actually cause damage to photographs. And you would know about magnetic albums or sticky albums that, you would put photographs in. I mean, family photos in my family are, in these albums, and they can actually damage the photographs and cause staining. They're made with poor quality materials, and you know, you might try and remove a photograph and it tears,
stuck, yeah.
So not so good there.
So there are many different kinds of sort of bases for photography over the centuries, and so albumin was one, gelatin another. So when you get old photographs, what sort of process do you have to go through to figure out or identify what kind of plate was used so that you can then either repair it or at least preserve it?
Yeah, well, that's the first thing that we do when come across a photograph, is try and identify what it is. And you know, photography is actually a really complex field, and even though the history is relatively short, there's lots of different processes, and it can be quite overwhelming to try and get your head around it. And I spent a lot of time trying to learn how to identify them and going to workshops and things like that. And even, you know, these experts who've been doing it for a lot longer than me can still struggle to identify things sometimes.
So it's a lot of detective work.
A lot of detective work, but you know, there are certain things that I would look for. I mean, what support it's on. Paper is the most common, obviously, but there's other supports like metal and glass and plastic. And then there's the whole layers. So there's one layer photographs, which is basically the image forming material on paper. And then there's two layer, which is involves a binder and the image forming material on paper. So albumin would be that. So that's, you know, the egg white and the silver. Example of a one layer process would be a salted paper print. And then there's the 3-layer process, which involves a brighter layer, which is this smooth white sort of intermediary layer between the paper and the binder and image forming material made of barium sulfate. And you can tell, you know, so you work out how many layers there are using magnification. When you look down and you can see paper fibres really clearly, you know, it's 1-layer process. If you can see them sort of slightly obscured, it's a 2-layer. And then you know, well, which processes are 2-layer, and you sort of go from there. So that's an important clue. And then how a photograph, well, there's image tone as well, can give clues, and then deterioration characteristics. So gelatin was a very common binder, you know, dominating in the 20th century with silver gelatin prints. But at the time of its introduction, there were collodion prints as well, so similar periods, sort of similar look. But so to be able to differentiate between the two, you get your clue from gelatin and how it behaves. It's a hygroscopic material, so it emits and absorbs moisture from the environment. And this allows certain chemical reactions to occur to the silver. So the silver can be oxidised to silver ions, and these silver ions can move through the photograph to the surface and then reduce to metallic silver, which appears as like this, you know, shiny film on the surface. We call it silver mirroring. And that just wouldn't really occur in a collodion photograph because collodion doesn't swell like that. But there would be other things that I know about collodion, like braids and scratches. So yeah, there's all kinds of things.
It's really interesting to me that gelatin is, you know, one of the more commonly used ones, and in the past albumin, and they're basically both. So albumin is egg white, but gelatin is pretty much a collection of proteins as well. So they're all collections of proteins that have certain textures and viscosities. And so they've both been used in photography, which also kind of brings to mind the fact that sometimes in the lab I've used a silver nitrate stain just to see proteins, and it's because they bind proteins, that silver binds proteins. And so I guess that's the basis for a lot of photography, but it's also that biological aspect, which is also why you should not take colloidal silver. So please don't do that because you will turn blue, because it will bind to you. irreversibly. So Katie, I guess a lot of your work is very much kind of forensic. It's forensic science because you're going backwards. You've got a result, you've got to go backwards and figure out what happened, which is different from other kinds of experiments that we do. So, I mean, how did you end up in this kind of work, and what sort of training was required for it? And
yeah, well,
is it hard to get into?
Well, I mean, for me, I'll tell my story. I was very humanities focused at school and university. I did an arts degree. I just wanted to learn more about art and literature and history, and that was really my focus. And then I guess when I was coming towards the end of my degree and wondering what to do, and I was travelling in Italy, as you do when you're a lover of art and literature and history, and I just had a chance encounter peeking through the doors at a museum, and I could see something going on behind those doors that interested me a lot. People, involved in conservation, which just thought, I actually didn't know anything about it, but I thought, I started looking into it and realised that was what I wanted to do. I'd actually abandoned science at year 10 level, and here I am on a Women in Science panel. Anyway, so I had to go back.
Science can take you anywhere, or it will find you anywhere.
I went back and did, year 12 chemistry at night school, and found out where I could study conservation. There was, at the time, only one place in Australia, and that was at the University of Canberra. Did an applied science, Bachelor of Applied Science, specialising in the conservation of cultural material. And then within that, you would specialise in paper or objects or paintings, and I chose paper, which encompasses photographs as well, because most of them are on a paper base, but, as I hope you would understand, photographs are a lot more complex than that and really deserve their own specialisation. But because I had an interest in photographs, I sort of have tried to take that further and taken on, what opportunities I can to learn as much as I can about photographs. But yeah, with the course, then it's really, once you start working, that, your learning really develops. And I was very lucky, I've been very lucky to remain employed. It's a small field, and
Don't listen to her, she's really good at what she does.
had really fabulous mentors, in the early years. And it's just, I've been doing it for 20 plus more years, but I'm still learning, and I'm really grateful for that, actually, because it makes it interesting and exciting, and I don't expect that to ever end. So.
Yeah, it must be fun. Plus you get
really
to handle really old sort of photographs and documents.
Yeah, well, that is the attraction for me. It's sort of kept me in that sort of art history world, but also using my hands and being practical and learning about the materiality of things and how they age and how we can sort of ease their aging and look after them and ensure they continue to exist, and that's so important. Especially
as, these things they are kind of fragile. They're very easy to damage, especially paper.
Yes.
And I think apparently sometimes you are forced to wash paper, but you can also repair it in various ways.
Yeah, we're not forced to wash paper, but we do.
But it's an option.
We do it. No, we do it. It's not the most common treatment, but yeah, there's definitely situations that call for it if you have soluble discoloration products in a paper that will be removed by washing, and there's, different levels that you can do that. One would be in a bath, which is basically, like a photo tray with your washing solution. So if your object can withstand that, and of course any washing is preceded by extensive testing of all the media and whether it's even going to be worth doing, with washing solutions and working out what's the most appropriate one. And then there's more, if an object is more fragile or has some sensitivity in terms of solubility, there's other ways to wash, like using suction using capillary action with on saturated thick blotter.
Oh, okay.
And
But don't try this at home.
No, absolutely don't try this at home. Something that we're using it's more of a new technique, I suppose, that we're really liking is the use of hydrogels. So they can be sort of a more controlled and targeted way of delivering moisture, perhaps locally if you've got stains.
Oh, so like made from gelatin or agarose?
Agarose, yeah.
Wow. You see,
And
I
gelling
told you
gum.
there's science at the library.
But yeah, I mean, washing is sort of one thing, but repairing tears we do a lot of that. So yeah, conservation may sound glamorous and everything, but a lot of it is staring at the back of an object and doing these very repetitive tasks, removing backings, repairing tears.
It sounds like science. Yeah.
But yeah, it's really fun actually. And tear repair is one of those techniques, treatments that we do that involves a lot of Japanese materials and techniques. We use...
How?
Well, Japanese papers are known, so they've sort of stood the test of time. We know them to be durable and strong. They're made from kozo fibres, well, the ones that we particularly use. And they have sort of, long fibres that mesh, and you can buy the papers in different thicknesses and textures that suit your object, and they're easy to use, and they just work well. And the adhesive, we use different adhesives, but the most common one would be wheat starch paste, which also has, a long tradition in Japan. And we make this up fresh each week. You make it up and then you sort of strain it through a horsehair strainer, which I've got an example of over there, and then you can dilute it. So even when it's quite dilute and you just want a thin paste, it's strong, and also importantly, it's reversible. Yeah, so you can undo it.
That's really amazing. I'm used to thinking of, I'm sure most of us are, of how delicate paper is, but the idea that it's repairable is wonderful.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you to all of you for this wonderful discussion. There's a lot of really unexpected science going on at the library. I mean, I use agarose in my work, but mostly to grow bacteria. Nothing as glamorous as repairing paper. The plates smell bad and they don't last long. It's amazing to think that there's actually a lot of wet lab work, a lot of forensic science, and a lot of creativity actually involved in, and you have to kind of invent your own. Do you want to? Well, you can show them now, or you can talk about them later.
So that's the silver mirroring that I was talking about.
Oh, right. So this is the silver mirroring.
Yeah, which you can remove. Or you can
from gelatin, from a gelatin plate. So the silver kind of starts to precipitate on top.
sort of see that metallic
It's a nice effect,
And
though.
this was a treatment that I was going to talk about, but there's not really time now. Anyway, this is a portrait of William Montgomery, who was a stained glass maker. And it came to us in this condition. It had been rolled and the paper was very brittle. So I had to go about repairing it, putting back together this puzzle. And it was very much a problem-solving exercise, because being a charcoal drawing, which is friable and powdery, so that's the consolidation process, which is basically applying a really thin film of adhesive on the surface so that it won't be smudgy when I'm turning it over to repair. So those are like strips of the Japanese paper, repair strips. And
Okay, so you actually had all of the pieces. It's just that.
no, don't have all the
Oh, you
pieces.
don't have all the pieces.
So this is the finished,
Oh,
there's a big gap.
there's still quite a lot of it. That's amazing.
It was, I mean, really, once we'd sort of worked out to do, and honestly this object sat in a drawer for several years because we weren't quite sure what approach to take. And it's okay to do that because we've got plenty of other things to treat.
Yeah.
We're always bringing new
Yeah, yeah.
to the lab.
So,
I think we loiter in the lab
Yeah.
because as curators, it's one of the best places to go to see other parts of the collection. But, and I know that I might be that person looking through the doors, actually, like you described, Katie, when you discovered conservation, because it's always like a real treat to see what everyone is working on.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we love to show people as well. Yeah.
It's really wonderful. Well, it's been fascinating to learn more about this exhibition, the way that there are many changing narratives about women in STEM. The role of women in STEM is probably much broader and longer. The history of women in STEM is longer. I mean, really, you could just, if we don't count modern scientific experimentation as the only way of doing STEM. I mean, as long as there is an investigation involved, and there's an understanding that if you're going to go and experiment and see what berries are poisonous or not, that's an experiment. You may not be able to write a report, but it is knowledge that's been handed down. So it's been fascinating to see how information is transmitted in different ways, shared in different ways, and expressed in different ways as well, even within the limitations of the role of women in the past. So that brings us to the end of this discussion. So please join me in thanking our wonderful guest speakers, Dr. Anna Welch, Linda Short, and Katie Glenn for joining us tonight. So the fun doesn't end here. We encourage you to stick around and enjoy some more science at the library. You can grab a drink. The exhibition will be open for the special after-dark viewing. You can talk to Katie if you have more questions about what she does. We've got a little setup to my right at the back, and of course the old books which we mentioned. So we suggest that you check out the exhibition, and the entry is just back out the door that you came in. So you just go down that way and then turn right. If you'd like to find out what other events are coming up at the library, you can find all the details via the website at slv.vic.gov.au. And just in conclusion, I think we'll put a few links up at one point, especially as Dr. Welch is actually on Instagram. So if you really need to see more old manuscripts, you can. She posts a lot about them on there, and it's just if you're as much of a book nerd as I am, it's wonderful. It's a real joy, and as well as the other events at the library that are coming. So thank you so much to all of you for coming tonight, and we hope to see you at another library event soon. And come and talk to us after this finishes. Thank you.